I'm Eliane Glaser. I'm a writer, lecturer and campaigner, and I'm interested in the ways in which political and corporate elites co-opt our desire for authenticity and our desire for people power and sell those valuable things back to us as empty brands. I think criticism and critique have become dirty words in our culture, that we're all supposed to be enthusiastic and engaged all the time. But I think that we need critique as never before. We need to read between the lines and identify all the myriad ways in which vested interests and hidden agendas are concealed in our culture and presented to us as the very opposite thing. But I think we also need to espouse and advocate for our own positive ideals and our positive agendas and to articulate the kind of world that we want to live in.
Any sane person today looking at politics, whether it's in the US or in the UK, can't look at it and think, wow, it's in a healthy state. You've written a lot about that. And also you've written a lot about the ideologies behind the new political left and right, if you like. When you look at politics today, whether it's in Westminster or in Congress, what do you see?
Well, I think in the olden days, back in the 20th century, people used to have a political ideology. An ideology is a terrible dinosaur word now. It's an obsolete word. It's actually a toxic word. People use it as an insult. They say, oh, the other side have an ideology. We're just doing what works. We're just getting the job done. But back in the olden days, people used to have an ism. They'd have a vision and a platform and a blueprint. They'd be idealistic about the kind of society they wanted to create. And actually, what's really interesting is that around 1989, that ended. So the end of the Cold War, the end of the opposition between right and left, east and west. Francis Fukuyama wrote his very influential End of History article. And actually those isms then were dead, they were defunct, and actually we all became pragmatists, we all became technocrats, and we all just believed in getting the job done. So I think what we're in now is this really weird situation where actually there's a real thirst for vision, for blueprints, for passion, for idealism. There's a real kind of inchoate desire for that. But actually we don't have the words to use to articulate that vision anymore, because ideology has become this toxic thing, this toxic category. So I think politics, post 1989, post Third Way, post Triangulation and the New Labour project, and the same thing happened in the States with Clinton, we've all centred around the political middle. And those really actually democratically healthy oppositions between right and left and different ways to imagine how we should run the world have really fallen by the wayside. And I think that creates enormous problems because there isn't the grounds for political communities to form, communities of allegiance and communities of interest. And I think that's when you have these moments, these great populist uprisings, this kind of Corbyn mania, or even going back to the Broom Brigade after the riots of 2011, there's that desire for community and communal feeling and solidarity that ideologies give you, because then actually community is formed in the opposition.
You've written a lot about neoliberalism and the pernicious effects of it and the material damage it does to the fabric of society. But if you ever speak to a neoliberal or a neoclassical, they say we don't have an ideology. There is no ideology.
Yeah.
How do you fight that? Because it's a brilliant, brilliant device.
Yes. So capitalism presents itself as not really an ism at all. It's just a force of nature like gravity or Darwinian evolution.
And the market is one of the measures of that force of nature.
Yeah, that's right. And before the 2008-9 crash, it was the market. So the markets rule, and there's this kind of weird authority that we can't see that's really mercurial. But actually after the financial crash, interestingly, austerity took over as the authority. And actually that created a much more sort of punitive, mean authority that we all live under. because that's the authority of work culture, you know, of working 16-hour days, paying off your debts, and this kind of weirdly retro discourse of, you know, we need to work to pay down the national debt, we need to increase productivity. So there's almost a use of this nostalgic sort of wartime rhetoric of working together in the national interest. But actually, who's benefiting? The financial and corporate elites are benefiting from austerity. Yeah. So there's a real double think there. And I think you've put your finger on it, that neoliberalism doesn't identify itself as an ideology at all. It just presents itself as common sense, as unavoidable reality. You know, and actually, what comes to be defined as realistic really closes down any sense of having an alternative, because if we're all governed by having to pay down the deficit, or we don't have much resources, you know, we need to live within our means, you know, that comes to define the limits of the possible politically. So you can't have an alternative, you can't have a left alternative. And I think that's really problematic in all sorts of ways. I mean, I think it's interesting with the rise of Corbyn, because I think that, and Bernie Sanders in the States, I think finally you are seeing the opening up of political opposition once again. But it's just that the problem is that it doesn't have a language with which to speak, because ideology is dead, right? So what words do we use? You know, do we say, oh, we need a different kind of common sense? But then actually people long for a vision. They don't want just common sense. They want something to really rally behind.
There must be a leader in the political ranks who sees the thirst for ideology, the thirst for solidarity, the thirst for idealism, who looks at the electorate and thinks, you know what, I'm going to give that. And we're seeing glimpses with it with Bernie Sanders and with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. Do you think, though, there is enough disenfranchisement and enough disillusionment with the current system for this to be a real bull market, if you like, to use their language, a bull market in descent, so we can come back to an idealism? Because this pragmatism and this realism, and politicians with their sleeves rolled up to show that they're doing the job and they're just getting on with it, it's offensive.
Yes, and that imagery of the high-vis jacket and the hard hat.
But now that has become, certainly in Britain, a chancellor out there looking as though he's getting things done. It's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, and it goes hand in hand with blue-collar conservatism and blue-collar republicanism in the States. That you have this kind of astroturf politics, you know, fake grassroots politics. So you pretend to be on the side of the working man, even though you are a financial elite or you're benefiting financial elites. And it's this politics of disguise where there's a sort of fake authentic politics where you say, we are the hardworking Tories, we are with you, the hardworking people. And actually your interests are not at all aligned.
And who determines hardworking? Pretty much everyone I meet, everyone's hardworking in their different way. You can't have this uniformity.
And also, who wants to work hard anyway? I mean, you know, John Maynard Keynes, you know, this great economic possibilities for our grandchildren, that we could all work 15-hour weeks, that technology would liberate us from labour. And actually, that's proved to be the opposite. So we're all working harder than before. And I think that the idealism that's emerging on the left is about, you know, how do we want to spend our lives? Do we want to spend our lives working really hard?
So this comes back to fleshing out an ideology or a set of principles to live by, is to say there is an alternative, because there are many, many alternatives. And I think that the Bernie Sanders of the world, the Jeremy Corbyns of the world, have worried the permanent political class because they are starting to see a groundswell. The
conditions for dissent emerging, I think that's a really important question. So it's almost as if people are really desperate, then they will protest. And actually, if they're really comfortable, they will also have the time to protest. The problem is in the middle, when people are really working hard, they're just getting by, and actually they don't have time to protest.
Is that where we are now?
Well, I think that we're on the boundary really between that kind of, you know, people are sort of discontented, but they're also apathetic and really tired, and also just they know that their choices are constrained actually. And before we began to see the emergence of a political alternative, you can understand, like, why engage with a political process when the two or three parties are the same, and you won't get change. So I kind of understand that apathy and that sense of powerlessness. But I think things are starting to shift. But I think, as I say, the problem is, how can you articulate this idealism? What words would you use? And Corbyn, I think, is a paradoxical figure, because on the one hand, he is idealistic. He is setting out a platform of beliefs that he's held since the 70s. But on the other hand, he stands for this kind of authenticity. He's a real person. He's not slick PR product of spin. But actually, I think there's a real problem with authenticity in our culture, because I think there's a great deal of fake authenticity around.
Name some fake authenticity.
Well, so in the past, we used to have these corporate and financial and political bogeymen, the sort of political big beasts, the Margaret Thatchers, the McDonalds, and these were enemies that we could easily identify as enemies, and as citizens, if we were like-minded, we would protest against those big powers. I think what's happened now is this kind of convergence, actually, between power and elites and us. So it's now, and you see this in marketing and PR language all the time, there's this language of engagement, of a two-way street. And I think this is problematic because it conceals the ways in which we're now still dominated, actually, and even more, society is even more unequal than it was before. But we have this sense that we're empowered, and I think fake authenticity really plugs into that, because, for example, cyber utopianism, so the internet provides a sense of everyone having a say, that this is now, the internet levels the playing field, that we all have a voice on Twitter and so on. But actually, in digital culture, real world inequalities are mirrored in that virtual sphere. And also, everyone has a voice, but who's being listened to? So there are kind of hidden inequalities that abound, actually, in internet, in digital culture. But the fake authenticity comes from this sense that we somehow have direct access to our audience. There's this kind of sense of unmediated, direct communication. And I think that is an illusion, actually, that there's the big internet giants, the tech moguls of Silicon Valley are mediating our communication all the time. But you see fake authenticity in all sorts of other areas too. You see it in food culture.
Give me an example.
Well, so there's a real desire for real food, authentic, organic, locally grown food. But actually the big supermarkets and chains have cottoned onto this. So supermarkets now sell their fruit and veg in sort of rustic baskets. And we have the mass market organics. It's organic, technically speaking, but it's mass market. It's industrially produced. Starbucks now has community personality coffee shops, which are kind of unbranded. Tesco's, Harrison Hall coffee shops that have this sort of artisan look and feel.
Don't people see through it?
I think people do see through it to a large extent. But I think there's this great rhetoric, actually, of the savvy consumer citizen, that we're all exercising our power at the till. We're all really media savvy. We all know how to decode adverts and so on. But actually, how could we? There's so much money being poured into this, viral advertising that seems like an entertaining video on YouTube, but is actually
flogging you something.
Yeah, but in this kind of very low-key way. And if you wander around Shoreditch in London, that's an example of, I can't even tell the difference between a cafe that's opening up that's covered in graffiti, that has those bare sort of Edison light bulbs, those wooden slab tables, wonderful artisanal sandwiches. How do you know?
The hipster makeover.
Yeah, the back to basics hipster movement. Yeah. And some of it's real and some of it's not. Yeah. And some of it's really hard to spot. And another example is the craft movement, the make, do and mend.
And the maker movement.
Yeah, which, it's very retro nostalgic, the sort of keep calm and carry on, reusable hemp bags and so on, and the embroidery movement, the sewing bees, which, in some ways this is fantastic. I love the fact that people are doing cross-stitch again, and baking cakes. But at the same time, that culture, that craftivism culture, comes to serve as a sort of cultural fig leaf for the fact that our lives are constantly mediated through screens, we're dominated by these big corporations and by financial interests. So actually we can all participate in this culture, and it serves as a kind of safety valve or a camouflage for what's really going on. And that's really my major critique. It's also co-opted by corporations and sold back to us as this empty brand, which then can function as a mass concealment for the fact that, you know, domination is by elites, you know, as never before. So it's really important to keep sight of the big picture.
So the big picture, what you're fleshing out as the big picture, is that financial elites or corporate interests have got their tentacles pretty much everywhere. The Western world, for want of a better expression, is running in many ways to keep still, because there are an awful lot of financial pressures which operate against the human being, if you like. It brings us to the economics, and you said that the word ideology is now a sort of dirty word in politics. People want a new ideology, they want a new narrative. It can't come without decent economics. How do we start using language, and what is the language of the new way to think about these?
Well, I think that language, that we're all trying to put together this new language. We're trying to create a new political and economic language from the ground up, actually. And I think that the building blocks of that new language are, you know, everyday life, work, home, how to live better, how do we want to spend our time, you know, what is work anyway? Is 9 to 5 just some sort of capitalist construct that we somehow bought into as being natural?
And these are really pressing questions, aren't they? Because there's at the moment a vacuum of meaning and purpose. People are searching desperately because they want something full of meaning and for their lives to be purposeful. And they're not at the moment.
And we also want a collective aspiration. We want to have good individual lives and good lives in our communities, but we also want to plug into a broader concern, which is actually about solidarity and linking up with other people who share our beliefs and values. You know, and I think it's that collective language, that political language, that we're really struggling to articulate. So the struggles are going on, you know, on a personal level, you know, in terms of rethinking the nature of work. And I think really in the future that's going to be the big question, is how to live, how to actually make enough money to live. I mean, the coalition government, when they talk about working hard and the you know, the virtues of work, actually that ignores the fact that whole sectors are collapsing, and actually whole areas of the professional and creative sectors that people used to be paid for doing things that they found fulfilling and creative, and actually those sectors are disappearing. And there's a massive disjunction between young people that are coming up through university and their aspirations. They want to go into, say, journalism, publishing, they want to become authors, and those sectors are just collapsing. So why don't we just use this as an opportunity, not to just keep flogging the dead horse of the kind of traditional jobs economy, but to rethink work actually from scratch. And try, you know, and there have been attempts to do that, for example, with the idea of a universal basic income that would allow us to do the things that we want to do, and that would actually be helpful for society. You know, caring for people, for example. Yeah. So I think that we really need to rethink work, but also in terms of economics on that macro level. I think there's a huge misunderstanding about macroeconomics. And that's as a result of deliberate obfuscation on the part of neoliberal elites and neoliberal politicians, which is to pretend that the economy is like a household budget and that we need to live within our means and balance the books and all of that, which is complete macroeconomic nonsense, actually. But it's a really, really useful metaphor, and it's a really handy metaphor.
And haven't they done brilliantly to use it?
Absolutely brilliant. So you see this in polling. So when people give responses in polling, in focus groups, the responses they give pretty much just mirrors government rhetoric in interviews on the Today programme, on the BBC and so on. So this is a real problem, and we need different metaphors to describe macroeconomics.
So we start by reclaiming the language. What else do we do?
We're at a really difficult crossroads right now, actually, because you know, we are in a post-political moment. You know, politics is a dirty word, you know, along with ideology. So what do? We don't have the language. People, ordinary people, I think, if you talk to most people, they would say, we want MPs to get the job done. We want our zebra crossings repainted. We want our school refurbished. And I completely understand it, because those things have fallen into disrepair. But we're in this kind of postmodern, sort of pre-linguistic moment, that how do we articulate our ideals? How do we come together? In the past there were allegiances of class identity and so on, but those allegiances have shifted, and actually our allegiances are now on things like national identity, which is why you've seen the rise of UKIP and so on, nationalism. But so these things are really up for grabs. I think we're in an extremely interesting moment, and we don't know where things are going to go.
Let me ask you, are we looking in the wrong place? Because a lot of people look at two men arguing at the dispatch box in the House of Commons here in the UK, and not many put the dots together and realise that those people are actually working for the financial interests in the city. So is it not the case that constantly looking to the permanent political class, the professional politician, for answers is absolutely, they're a colossal distraction? And is it not the case that we should be looking at ourselves? Because one of the things that we've lost is personal sovereignty. And I want your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think sovereignty is a really key word actually at the moment. It's that kind of sense of, autonomy and influence and self-determination, which is really key. But I think it's really confusing, because you look to Parliament, and Parliament has become corrupted and distorted by financial and corporate interests. But actually, I think we're really confused about this central question, and that is, if those distorting influences weren't there, if we could turn the clock back and actually representative democracy worked in the way that it was intended, would we want that system back? Or is that system actually now completely defunct and obsolete, and we need some new form of kind of direct democracy, local democracy, workplace democracy? And I think we're really confused about that question, because we see this crumbling, Westminster system, Prime Minister's question.
Very centralised.
Yeah. But I think we're really confused on that, and I think we kind of have to face up to that, because on the one hand we say we want localism, we want autonomy, we want direct democracy and town hall meetings and so on.
And in the same breath, we look to Parliament.
Right, and I think that's part of the crossroads we're at, is we've got a crumbling Westminster system, we've got a crumbling democracy, and actually the new institutions that we might look to in the future to create the society we want to see, those institutions and that kind of political public space is not yet in existence, and it's in little pockets, and you find little examples of it everywhere actually. But the question is, how do you scale that up? Is that kind of grassroots energy enough to combat the forces of corporate financial power, the tech giants of Silicon Valley, surveillance? And to me that's the question, because that gets you back to the question of politics, right? So if politics is dead, then what other way do we have of scaling that up? And I think that comes back to this question of the internet.
There seems to be, the rhetoric around the internet is that it's limitless and it's going to change everything, and this, as you called it, cyber utopia is going to prevail. It's too glib, isn't it, to say that?
Well, I think the irony is that the great excitement around the internet was about its ability to network people, and this to create horizontal means of communication between people, but that's precisely what it's failing at. And I think that's the conversation that I want to have with the cyber utopians, to say, yes, the internet potentially has great political potential, but if we can't work out how to link up all these fantastic grassroots, emergent projects, then we can't create an enduring alternative.
And lots of people are talking about it. We had a letter in from Maria Miller in the US, and she's on the topic of this conversation and really your books and the neoliberal ideology. That's what she's talking about here. She's saying, how is this not common knowledge? I'm a normal middle-class stay-at-home mum in America, and I feel outraged that most people who live here seems to have no idea how these economic issues all work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this great phrase, lipstick on a pig. And I think this image, for me, encapsulates our times, really. That in the past, it was so easy to spot who the big culprits were. And now there's all this delusion sloshing around. And actually, appearance is the opposite of reality in so many different spheres. You know, the internet as this egalitarian tool, well, actually, it's the tech giants of Silicon Valley. No. You know, people power, you know, in an age of huge inequality. Mass organics, you know, this great food culture, grow your own movement in an age of mass-produced food. So in all these different spheres, you know, actually the message that we're being given is not just airbrushing the reality, it's deliberately the opposite of the reality, so that we are in effect deluded. I mean, we do kind of know that we're being deluded. But
we go along with it.
But we don't have choices, number one, and also we don't have the information to make good decisions. So we know that the wall is being pulled over our eyes, but actually the illusions are also so attractive. You know, the ability to use Twitter and to share a viral video.
That escapism is intoxicating.
Right, yeah, and we're all working so hard that we kind of want to watch a flash mob dance-a-thon filmed in Liverpool Street Station because it gives us this sense of
things are happening.
And collectivity, escape, joy. So I think that there is a kind of mass cognitive dissonance that we know is going on, but it's very difficult to get out of nonetheless. And I think that you know, this project, the reason why we're in this double bind, you know, it has a name, and that name is neoliberalism.
You're going to give us 3 ways of getting out of our double bind.
Okay.
Because as you've written, neoliberalism wasn't built in a day, and it was a very deliberate project over the last 40 years, actually.
Yeah.
First solution, and we're going to hold you to it unequivocally.
I think we need to spot the ways in which we are being lied to in these very nuanced and insidious ways, and become really literary critics of our environment. Yeah. To look around and read between the lines.
Got it. Eyes wide open.
Yeah.
First one. Second one.
I think we need to develop a new political language. You know, the old words, the old labels are dead.
Left and right.
Yeah. Socialism, it's all
Capitalism.
dead. Yeah,
all
that's
dead.
Gotta go.
Yeah, it's all got to go.
It's all gone.
Right.
So we need to really think about what kind of words what kind of language we can use to create, you know, collective solidarity. You know, a language of idealism and that we can actually rally around.
Done. Eyes wide open. New language. 3.
I think the third one is to name your enemy, to really understand your enemy, and to understand that when we're told that something is common sense, that it's natural, that it's inevitable, there's no choice.
That's when the alarm bell should go
off. Right, that actually there are always choices. They're always political. These things are always political.
Eyes wide open, a whole new language, know thy enemy. And we're done with that. That's Renaissance.
Rethink work.
and lastly, rethinking work.
Yeah. So we have the time to actually, you know, read our culture properly, you know, live a good life, think about inequality, care for our friends and family.
All the things that make us human. Eliane, it's been wide-ranging and wonderful. Thank you so much for coming in. Thanks for your time. With the Meet the Renegades programme, we always give a Renegade pin. Revolution starts here, basically.
Thanks very much.
And it's for those who think differently. You certainly do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll wear it with pride.